Right now in this segment is the prolific and talented author Jonathan Tropper, and we'll be talking to him about his highly successful new novel from Dutton Publishers titled This Is Where I Leave You, just released today. Later on in the show, we'll have two other guests, Scott Robinson from the Boys and Girls Club of Cathedral City and Jerry Donato from Cathedral City Senior Center. Right now, I do want to welcome Jonathan. And Jonathan, I am so happy to have you on the show today. Thanks for spending part of your day with me.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Jonathan, I just want to synopsize a little bit about the book, and then we'll get back to you. I just want to tell my listeners that this book that is so incredible is about relatives coming together for a week after the death of a family member for a Jewish tradition called sitting Shiva. But it's not a typical gathering of mourning, while that's a big part of the story. So are events including sex, fistfights, comedic happenings, and destruction and rebuilding on relationships. Jonathan, this was such a great book, your fifth novel. To further develop its theme, would you give my audience your overview of the story?
I had originally started out, I wanted to tell the story about one man who, the narrator of this novel, Judd Foxman, who basically on the same day he loses his wife and his job because he discovers that his wife's been having an affair with his boss. So he's a man who's been stripped of all the things that he thought made him who he was, his marriage and his job, which is absolutely the worst time to have to come home and face your own nuclear family. He's struggling with all these personal issues, and it's 3 months into his struggle that his father passes away and leaves behind this strange request that all the siblings come together and sit Shiva for him. This was not a religious family. They had not been raised with any religious traditions, and they couldn't understand why he was making that request. But, you know, everyone likes to honor the requests of the dying, so Judd comes back home to meet his other three estranged siblings, and the four of them and their mother are forced to spend 7 days living in their childhood home, kind of dealing with each other after years of having pretty much avoided each other.
Now, Jonathan, for my listeners who may not be familiar with the Jewish tradition of a Shiva, would you explain what it is, please?
It's done differently depending on your level of observance, but basically the ritual calls for the immediate members of the family, sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, husbands, and wives, to come together and basically spend a week under one roof, sitting on low chairs as a sign of mourning, and you basically sit there all day and kind of contemplate the life of the person who's passed away, while members of the extended family, members of the community, friends, all come and visit you to pay respects. And it's a ritual that's supposed to bring comfort to the mourners, while at the same time honor the memory of the deceased.
Yes.
That's not quite how it works out in my book, though.
Well, it's fantastic what the things that do work out. Well, as you said, it's about Judd Foxman, and he, as you also explained, he's lost his father, been humiliated by his wife, and he's having an affair with Judd's boss Wade, a point now painfully public to all who know him. And in the first 3 chapters, actually, it's about the first 25 pages, there's a lot that happens. And what came first in the creation process in those opening 25 pages? Because in my opinion, they're the saddest, funniest, most shocking, attention-getting few pages that I have ever read.
Well, I guess thank you, I think.
Yes, it was incredible. So I know you say that your novels are character-driven, but in this instance, what came first in the creation process in this opening?
So what came first for me, actually, long before I had the idea of the Shiva, was the character of Judd Foxman. I wanted to write about a man who was stripped of all the things that he thought made him a man and follow his journey back towards, some kind of peace. He was losing his wife. He was losing his job. He was basically going to be on a quest to rediscover his manhood at the age of 34. So I started really with that. I started basically writing with the scene of Judd coming home with his wife's birthday cake and finding her in bed with his boss.
Incredible scene. Incredible. Yeah. And we won't give that away because it's fantastic.
Right. Let's just say sex and cheesecake don't mix well.
Yes.
um, but that was really where I started, and I planned a very different story for Judd. But what happened was I was about 70 or 80 pages into the novel, and I had a chapter where he comes home to see his family for a birthday party, not for any kind of sad occasion.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the first time he's faced with his family since all this happened. And for me, something happened as I was writing those two chapters. The family and all their interactions came alive for me in a way that pretty much everything I had written before hadn't. And I just decided to retool the whole book and make it about Judd coming home and being forced to spend time with his family, because those characters just woke me up in a way all the characters I'd put into the book until then hadn't. So that's when I came up with the idea of him coming home to sit Shiva, because it basically forced him to spend 7 days with all these characters that I was having such a blast writing about.
Oh, well, it was a fantastic idea, and I love the way that you did the flashback and everything else that was going on there. Now, some have described, in some of the write-ups I've read, some have described the family as dysfunctional, but I kind of thought that, is there any family that doesn't have a family member like the charming kid brother Philip, who was the father's favorite, but never succeeded at anything, or the mother that was so over the top in her openness with the kids? As bizarre as some things get, the characters and events in the book still feel real. Talk about that point in your character development, obviously.
Well, I hear that a lot with all of my books, that people talk about these dysfunctional families I write about, but I don't think of them as any more or less. What families are functional? What's a functional family? These are families where people have difficult relationships and have long, buried resentments and long-standing grudges, and I think that's a lot of families, and yet they are still functioning. They're still coming together. They still feel, despite all their differences, that they belong in the same house for this. So, I don't think they're dysfunctional only as much as every family is dysfunctional. The difference is, because I'm writing about them in such great detail, you're learning all the ins and outs of them, whereas most families other than your own, a lot of that stuff stays below the surface to the outside eye. But in fact, if you know your own family, I'm sure there are things you can relate to about that, long-standing grudges, or not even grudges, but hurts. Things you grew up wishing were differently, things that happen that you can't undo, and the way you regress when you come into the presence of all your family members. I think that everyone goes through that to some degree or another, but when you're writing a novel about it, you flesh it out much more deeply.
Yes, and I'm sure everyone that has read this book, and that's why your books resonate so much, recalls incidents such as those, maybe not as intense as some of the things that go on in the book, but I think that's why the characters are so real, because we all have had that kind of experience. This is the Jacqueline Bachar Show, and I'm talking to novelist Jonathan Tropper about his latest book from Dutton Publisher, This Is Where I Leave You, and it's just released today. Do you think that the events and characters in the book, and you've touched on that, but some of the events that go on, do you think they don't seem quite so weird to the readers because of the mores of modern society? Maybe older generations didn't go through some of these things, but certainly we hear a lot about what is going on. Marriages aren't lasting. How do you feel about that? Do you feel that you've captured modern society?
Well, yeah, I think I've captured modern society by putting it into a magnification that may be slightly hyper-realistic. No one's really interested. If you write about real characters, but in real time, it won't be as interesting, because people pick their moments where they're going to act out. Mm-hmm. And for the most part, most of us, because of social boundaries, tend to hold things in, to do them in private, to take care of things in a more subdued way. And only in those extreme moments of emotional duress do we live out loud. I tend in my books to have all my characters hitting their emotional duress right around the same time. And so there's a little more living out loud than I think probably happens in real life over the course of 7 days. I think any one of the scenes in my book could happen in real life and feels real. Having them all kind of strung together like that is sort of a dramatic license you take when you're writing a novel, because you have you're really trying to show everything that's going on inside these people's heads, and so you take a certain dramatic license to let a lot go on that maybe in real life would take months to happen, and here I'm cramming it into a week.
Well, that's a great description of your thought process on that, and yet I wondered at the same time in reading it, yes, that may be that it doesn't happen all at the same time, but again, it doesn't, and I guess it also shows what a great writer you are, because it doesn't feel over the top, as in some movies you might go to. It all feels like, well, that's overdone. There's nothing in your writing that feels overdone. So describing that way as realist, I think, is a great way to describe it.
Yeah, I mean, I work very hard on my characters to make them very relatable. There's no one who's entirely likable or who's entirely, unlikable. I try to make my philosophy going into any novel is that people are not consistent, and I try to make characters that are, predictably unpredictable in a way. You get to know them and you get to understand them, but you still can be surprised by how they behave.
Yes.
And I think that makes it feel very real to you, because I think that's what goes on every day.
Mm-hmm. Well, another thing that I want to ask you about, the overleaf of the novel refers to the work as, quote, emotionally raw. Where does the rawness come from within you or your experience? And do you feel that is a good description from whoever wrote the overleaf, whether it's a publicist? Yeah, did you?
I generally don't. I usually get it and then kind of edit it because and then it goes through. But I don't write the whole thing.
Well, would you agree with that description?
Yeah, but I think that description is more a stylistic description in that I tend to present some of the more base emotions my characters are going through. I don't present them necessarily in a noble light, and I give a very, I think, brutally honest depiction of every range of emotion and every thought that they're having. And some of those are not necessarily generous or sympathetic thoughts. But I'm trying to really convey what people going through these things, what they might really be thinking. And when people are going through difficult times, they'll share certain thoughts, and certain thoughts we won't share because they're really controversial and or don't reflect that well upon us. But in this book, I kind of allow the characters to share those thoughts as well, even if they don't particularly reflect well on the character.
Mm-hmm. Now, what is also surprising is that, to me, is that you didn't start writing novels for quite some time. How old were you, or about how many years ago did you really start writing? And your first book, the first novel that you wrote, I know got a lot of attention. So. How long ago was that?
Well, yeah, my first novel was published when I was 30 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I sold it when I was 28.
That's great.
And I had been writing for quite a while before that. I just hadn't managed to get published.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd always wanted to be a writer. Really, from the time I got to college, I felt that's something I wanted to do. I just didn't really believe I'd ever get published. So even while I tried it, I was also, moving forward in other directions because I didn't believe I'd ever be successful.
Yeah, so you did just let it go for a while, didn't you? How long was that?
I wrote a book. I wrote a book around 1993, sent it out to a whole bunch of agencies, got rejected across the board, and at that point I put it down for a while. And it probably from 1993 to 1997, I didn't really write. I went into business and I was making a living, and I got married and I was just doing other things. And then I decided I needed to try again at one point, and I happened to be properly inspired that time, I guess, and it took me about 8 months, and I wrote another novel. And as soon as I finished it, I was pretty sure it was going to get published. And then it went from there.
But another thought that I had as well is that while the characters were kicking and screaming about coming together for the Shiva, they all did. And so, can you elaborate upon that a little more? Are you in what you're saying about this family or families in general?
Yeah, I just think that people like to talk about any novel or movie that has families kind of behaving oddly or not getting along with each other or things like that as a dysfunctional family. But the fact is, this is a family who experienced the death. They lost their father. Their mother lost her husband. And even though they dreaded it and they weren't excited about it and they had a lot of issues with each other, no one ever thought about not coming. And they all still came because it wouldn't have occurred to them not to come because this is their family. And in my mind, that's actually a functional family, not a dysfunctional family. In a dysfunctional family, you'll have brothers and sisters who are so angry at each other that they refuse to come together to bury their father. And that's, to me, that's dysfunctional.
Yes. Do you think the term itself is overused?
Absolutely.
Yes. If people aren't some of the old TV shows that used to be on about this wonderful dad and wonderful mom and everybody's sweet and happy, then other families are dysfunctional. So it certainly is overused.
Yeah, this is a modern family. They might be a somewhat estranged family, but they're still a perfectly functional family. They all still care about each other.
3 of your novels are being developed for movies now, and the rights for this book has also been sold for a motion picture. You've been working on the script. Let me ask you, and I suppose others have asked you the same thing, but when you wrote this novel, were you thinking about it becoming a movie?
No. Believe it or not, for the last 2 books, my goal has been to write something that nobody wants to option. And it's just part of it is that once you get a reputation as having books that studios like, there tends to be almost a frenzy when the next one's ready, and I think people get excited before they even fully have thought about it. But on the other hand, I think there aren't that many people writing such heavily character-driven books right now that are also really sort of accessible entertainment. And I think producers and studios are really looking for characters, that will appeal to talent. And they read a book, and there's a handful of really, colorful characters, and they can see in their heads how this will, translate into a script that attracts talent.
So you're on their horizon. They're waiting for you then.
When my books are getting finished, my agents start getting calls already. Can we see it? When can we see it? Don't forget to show it to us. And, it definitely helps you sell it. But this book, when you read this book, it's actually a very internal book. And I just actually finished writing the first draft of the script for this. I never adapted any of my other books for a studio
What made
before.
you decide to do it for this one?
Because they let me, because I did enough work that they were confident in me as a screenwriter. Normally when a studio is shelling out a decent amount of money for a property, they want the freedom to hire an accomplished screenwriter. So even though I might have been interested in it, they wouldn't have been interested in optioning it with me attached as the writer. But in this case, I had already done some screenwriting work that had nothing to do with my book, so there were samples out there they could look at, and because of all of that, they were willing to give me a shot. But
now, I know you don't want to give anything away in terms of how you're going to be doing the script, because this book is just out, of course, and we want people to get a copy of it, and I encourage all of my listeners to do so. It's just an incredible piece of fiction. But can you say a few things in general about how you're working on the script that differs from how it went when you were working on this novel? Because, as you said, there's a lot of internal stuff. And
right, and that's why I didn't think it was going to get optioned, is because a lot of what happens in this book is not stuff that would happen on the screen. It's things that are happening in Judd's head. It's flashbacks. It's emotional responses inside. And at the same time, there is a lot of fun stuff that happens that will probably translate really well onto screen. My biggest challenge, and I've had help with the director who's attached, Greg Berlanti, who's a very experienced TV writer as well, was in figuring out how to compress events and how to. There's way too much in this book to fit into a 2-hour movie.
Yes,
so
I agree with that.
We spent a lot of time, and this book takes place over the 7 days of a Shiva, and my goal is for the movie to take place over those 7 days as well, but. We had to really make a timeline and figure out how to let the character arcs evolve over 7 days, during a film, because it's there's a different rhythm to a film than a book. In a book, you don't have to kind of reach one, there aren't 3 acts in a book. There's as many chapters as you want, and things can crescendo and then go back down and crescendo again, whereas movies have more of a definitive rhythm. Things have to build to a certain point, then they have to climax, and then they have to resolve. And so there was a lot of time spent just kind of figuring out the timeline, how to tell as many stories as possible while keeping that timeline going, and which stories we had to get rid of in order to, keep a coherent timeline going.
So then, how do you translate in that situation from the individual's inner thoughts to presenting it in the screenplay,
right?
Things that they would say out loud, or other things that would be portrayed in action that would tell the viewer what their thought process was.
Yeah, that's exactly the challenge. Is I'm not using a voiceover, and
Good.
whereas the novel is in the first person, and because of that, you're given a lot of information. The film is not in the first person, and everything that you need to know has to somehow be shown.
Do you find that as a challenge, Jonathan?
It's a huge challenge. It's not, to me, that's always a challenge of screenwriting, but it's more of a challenge when you're adapting, because there's so much information you take for granted from the book, and then you have to figure out, well, how am I going to convey that in a film? And sometimes the answer is, guess what? You're not. That subplot has no place in this movie.
Oh, that's tough.
You remove something.
You have to kill off certain aspects of the characters.
Absolutely.
Then. Yeah, that has to be difficult. How long did it actually take you to complete this novel?
The novel took a long time because, as I described before, I started out with a different idea, and I had to scrap it. The novel took me about 15 months, which is long for me, but, I always, that's starting to become my process, that halfway through I figure out a better way to write it and I have to throw out 50 or 100 pages.
Right.
And then, so it took about, I'd say all told, about 15 months.
Well, probably if there's some people out there that are writers, they're thinking, well, gee, that doesn't sound like so long. But as you said, that's a little longer for you.
No, but, and you know what, I've learned that there is no average speed. I know people who write great novels that they say they've written in 2 or 3 months. And I'm jealous of those people. And then I know there are people who take years and years. And, so I don't think there is any proper time.
No, it's interesting, though. People always want to know about writers' process, so they're interesting points. Now,
not the worst guy to ask.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Critics have compared you, and I know you're waiting for this question, critics have compared you to the British writer Nick Hornby, and that's been from the very first novel, I believe.
Yeah, I get that a lot.
Yeah, and you've said that when because of that comparison, your answer to that is it's because there aren't many men writing in an accessible manner about the topics he and I write, unquote. What did you mean by that?
Well, women's fiction, and some people refer to an aspect of that as chick lit. Some people, just call it women's fiction. But it's perfectly expected for there to be a lot of books written by women about family relationships and romantic relationships and things of that nature. Coming to terms with life relationships. There aren't that many men who deal with that. There are some who do it in literary fiction and tend to get maybe a smaller audience for it, but there aren't that many men writing commercial fiction who are writing about men coming of age, dealing with relationship issues and family issues. But the truth is, people compare me to Nick Hornby, and that comparison, has always been flattering to me because I think he's a great writer. but they're comparing me to the Nick Hornby of years ago. I mean, because Nick Hornby can't be compared to Nick Hornby anymore. He's moved on, and he's writing other kinds of books, and I'm trying to move on and write other kinds of books too. So at some point, that comparison has just become sort of an easy go-to comparison.
I love that comment that Nick Hornby can't be compared to Nick Hornby. That is really terrific. This is the Jacqueline Bachar Show, and I'm talking to novelist Jonathan Tropper about his latest novel from Dutton Books, just released today, This Is Where I Leave You. Jonathan, to get back to what you were saying about the kind of books, then, and we'll just talk about the kind of books that you're writing right now. We won't bring Nick Hornby into it. But are you saying that this is a novel that only a male writer could write?
Oh, I don't know. I think my point of view is uniquely male. I think I'm in the head of a man here, looking at the way he looks at women, looking at the way he looks at sexuality, looking at the way he measures his own value. I mean, I think there are probably talented women who could get in the head of a man like that, but it came very naturally to me to write about it like that.
Well, you seem to also, though, be able to portray the female characters very well. So that might be a moot point, but I think it's a question that my listeners would have liked me to ask.
Yeah,
go ahead.
My rule of thumb when it comes to portraying women or men or children or anything is it's the same rule of thumb. Don't treat her like a woman or like a man. Treat her like a character.
Very good.
And give her whatever attributes you want to give her as a character, and if you make her real, she'll be a real woman. But I don't think it's necessarily always right to think that a man might have trouble portraying a woman or a woman have trouble portraying a man. I think as long as you always come back to the fact, is this a fully rounded, complex, and flawed character, you're going to do okay, whether it's a man or a woman.
You seem to, as I mentioned briefly earlier, have the pulse of a certain age group of the male population, and it's kind of a repetitive question, but it brings in another point of view. Do you believe that the characters, the male characters in this novel in particular, mirror an aspect of today's men, especially Judd's sexual insecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think. Well, first of all, I think men today do come of age later.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they are both encouraged and inspired to stay young and almost stay juvenile longer. And what happens is the rest of life goes on, and they tend to come of age later. And I think a lot of my novels are about men who are suddenly coming of age at a later point than they ought to have. And I think that does reflect what's happening today. So yeah, I mean, it's a generalization, but I do think, that that's what men today are grappling with is what does it mean to be an adult male today, and at what point do you put childish things behind or not?
That's a very good point. Now, throughout the book, Judd's, I don't know if we want to call it a problem, but Judd had the issue of needing to prove not only his sexuality, but that another woman could fall in love with him. And he would walk down the street and see a complete stranger and just fantasize about that woman loving him. And that's probably all part of it. But the book is about many things, including that. So what do you say is its ultimate message?
Oh, wow, a message.
Everybody's going to get a message. Try to find the message in the book.
To me, I guess Judd's biggest lesson or the message here is that it's never too late to start from scratch. And, we all make plans for the way we want our lives to work out, and they're not always going to work out that way. And at some point, you have to stop trying to cling to a life that's not working and be open to the possibility of an uncharted future.
That's a great response. very briefly, I have just one final question. When I finished this book, I felt like there might be a sequel. Any plans for that? Yes
None
or
at
no?
all.
None at all.
I've never thought about a sequel to any of my books.
Well, Jonathan, it's just been wonderful talking to you. The books are fantastic. I'm anxious to hear more about the movie as it's developing. But as your title says, Jonathan, this is where I leave you. However, I do hope you'll come back when your next book is ready. Maybe we can even talk to you when the film is ready to come together. And
I'd be
I want
happy to.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you so much for being here. And
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I look forward to having you here again. Thank you so much. I've been talking to novelist Jonathan Tropper about his latest book from Dutton Publishers. This is Where I Leave You, in stores starting today. This is the Jacqueline Bachar Show.